Hey guys, it's Neil, otherwise known as Dragon Cannon, and today we are going to do an Apollo style mission to the moon in Kerbal Space Program. Here is my model of a Saturn V rocket. It weighs in at 513 tons. There are 3 stages plus a lander and a command service module. It is more or less set up like an actual Saturn V rocket. It is actually overfueled, and we will end up wasting some fuel on this mission. We will ditch stages while they still have fuel in order to, as closely as possible, emulate the real Apollo missions. So without further delay, we will launch in 5, 4, 3, ignition sequence start, 1, liftoff. And Apollo 11 has cleared the tower. So we have a bottom stage with 5 main sails. When it is dropped, we will have a second stage which will do our orbital insertion with 5 skipper engines. And then for our K4B, my version of the S4B on the real Saturn V rocket, we have 4 LV909 engines which will do our trans-lunar injection. We have also included, of course, a lander, which I've gone ahead and put Kerbals in so we would not have to transfer crew during EVA until we take back off from the moon. And I have included an escape tower in case there is some sort of a disaster and the crew needs to escape quickly from an exploding rocket, which we hope will not happen today. I've tested this rocket, so we should be okay. But nonetheless, we've included the escape tower so that we can be ready for any possible event that could occur. In the meantime, we are launching. So you see, it's a rather large rocket. As I said, 513 tons. It's actually relatively small part count, only 211 parts, I believe. So really not that many, which is good. And we are going to emulate the mission profile as closely as possible of the real Apollo missions. Of course, there were multiple Apollo missions to the moon. Apollo 8 orbited the moon. The lunar lander was not yet ready when Apollo 8 was launched. So they only went to the moon, orbited, and came back to the Earth without landing. Apollo 10, which tested the lunar lander, but did not actually land. They just did part of the descent and then flew back up and rendezvoused with the command module. And of course, the famous Apollo 11, commanded by Neil Armstrong, in which the very first human being set foot on another world, when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, along with Buzz Aldrin, while Michael Collins waited in orbit for their return. Then you also had Apollo 12 landed on the moon. Apollo 13, of course, had the infamous disaster and did not land on the moon. However, they did do a trans-lunar injection and later a free return trajectory in order to fly back to the moon. A free return trajectory is effectively slingshotting yourself using the moon's gravity to come back to the Earth, or in the case of Kerbal, come back to Kerbin. And we have dropped the first stage, fired up the second stage, and we continue to climb. Once we get up to a safe altitude and velocity, we will be ditching our launch escape system. This is, of course, extra weight, but it ensures the safety of the crew. But once you're at a certain altitude and a certain velocity, it will be just as easy to abort using other methods rather than using the launch escape system. And this will be coming up rather shortly. When we get to 20,000 meters, I will ditch that here, and there is our destination, the moon. Beautiful sight, huh? They really did a good job with this game. And we have Tower Jet. Look at that. Flying off into the distance. We're going to keep turning some more in our gravity turn. We'll go do a quick check in the map view. See how we're doing. Everything's looking good. Once we get up to about 900 meters a second, we'll turn some more. I'm going to go ahead and start doing that. We're getting close. Once we're out of the thick atmosphere, it's really better to be going as much sideways as possible. We want to, because ultimately orbit is about having more sideways velocity, and go sideways faster than gravity pulls you back towards the planet. And you fall effectively, or falling around the planet that you are orbiting. Of course, you need to be out of the atmosphere, which in Kerbal Space Program stops at about 70 kilometers. In real life, what is called the Kármán line, which is, quote, officially the end of the atmosphere, is 100 kilometers. However, the atmosphere does not really end in real life. It just keeps getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And the Kármán line is determined by the fact that you would need to be going faster than orbital velocity in order for wings to generate lift in that thin of atmosphere. So it is not truly out of the atmosphere, so to speak. Of course, in Kerbal at 70 kilometers, it completely goes away. I've decided to launch into an 80 kilometer orbit. We could do lower, but I like to do about 80, because when you do an 80 kilometer orbit, you give yourself a little bit of a margin for error, but not so much that you reduce the Oberth effect. For those of you that don't know, which anyone who plays Kerbal Space Program or watches Scott Manley videos should be familiar with the Oberth effect. But if you are not, the Oberth effect basically says the faster you are going when you burn your engines, the more delta V you get for the same amount of fuel. Effectively, your delta V is proportional to the speed that you are traveling. So we're going to go ahead and launch ourselves into a circular orbit here. Pretty close, 84 by 77, we'll take that. And as you see, we have extra fuel here, but we're going to go ahead and ditch this stage. Do a quick burn to move ourselves away from the wreckage, away from our ditched stage. And here we go, this is our K4B stage. We'll set up a lunar injection, which will basically be 3/4 of an orbit, more or less, from now, and burn out. Of course, on the real Apollo missions, they did what's called a free return trajectory. We are not going to be doing that here, but a free return trajectory effectively means that you will go slingshot around the moon. I think I described this earlier in the video, but if I did not, you will slingshot around the moon and be brought back on a course that will bring you to re-enter on Earth, or in Kerbal Space Program to Kerbin. This is great for safety if your engines do not fire to put yourself into a lunar orbit. You are on a course already that will bring you home. However, in Kerbal Space Program, this does not happen. Your engines will always fire, assuming that you do not have rapid unplanned disassembly of your spacecraft. Thus, there's not much use for a free return trajectory in this game. Rather than, I could do one to emulate as closely as possible the real Apollo missions, but we're doing that in many other ways. We are not going to actually be doing a free return trajectory. Instead, we are going to put ourselves on a trajectory that will bring us on a relatively low pass by the moon. And there it is, the moon coming up over Kerbin. we're going ahead and burning. Have another 3.5 minutes about of burn until we arrive on the point that we will cut our engines. At that point we will cut our engines and perform some delicate docking maneuvers here. Because of the way the game is set up, this will be a little bit problematic. What we're going to do is cut our engines, drop our S4B stage, which is actually going to have plenty of fuel left in it, but we're going to drop it in order to simulate the way the real Apollo missions worked. Then we're going to decouple the lander from the command pod, from the command service module. The command service module will move away slightly, turn around, and come dock with the lander. However, because of the way the game works, there will be this decoupler and shroud in the way. So we're going to have to use the command module to actually knock it out of the way before moving in to dock with the lander. This is relatively common. Anyone who plays this game and has tried to do an Apollo style mission has experienced the same thing. For the record, Apollo style missions in Kerbal Space Program is not in any means the most efficient way to go to the moon. In real life, it's a very efficient method because the sizes of the planets and the moons is much larger, about 10 times or 11 times, something like that scale. The gravity is similar, however, due to the size differences, the delta V is significantly higher than is required to do these things, which makes it a really good idea to do this. In actuality, we are wasting a bunch of fuel performing a mission in this profile. The only reason to do this on a moon mission in Kerbal Space Program is simply because we can, and because it's fun. Now, contrary to this, low Kerbin rendezvous is a very good method to go to Duna, which is, of course, the Kerbal Space Program Mars analog, or some of the other planets. Pretty much any other planet, but going to the moon is not the most efficient choice. So we have about 30 more seconds to burn, and then we will cut our engines with about a third to a quarter of fuel left, somewhere in that range, which is really somewhat wasteful, which again, if we were really being serious about efficiency, we would not do. We would continue to make use of that fuel. But we're going more for historical accuracy than we are going for efficiency. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this maneuver so we don't get any problems here, and just lower our moon apoapsis, which right now we're on a collision course, which I guess is good, because now when we drop this stage it will crash into the moon. Now, of course, we have a delicate docking maneuver to perform, so we'll go ahead and decouple the stack separator and put ourselves into chase cam. Chase cam is great for docking because it allows you to stay oriented to your spacecraft. And then we'll activate the RCS and burn back this way. We're trying to set this as our target and having a little bit of trouble, but no matter. We'll get over here and we'll deal with those problems as we get closer to this spacecraft. The decoupler, the force of the decoupler sent us a little bit away. But we're slowly but surely making our way back. Once we get here, as you see, we have this shroud and decoupler just sitting here in the way. And we're going to have to knock it out of the way. And once we do that, we're going to See, we're coming up to the side, which is not particularly good for us. But once we knock these things out of the way, we'll back up and put ourselves on the so we can dock. Here we go. We've knocked it a little bit. Let's go ahead and set this docking port as our target. We're going to just try to come around. So you see the shroud is just flying all around here. But no matter, we're just pushing it out of the way. At this point we want to line ourselves up to dock. And we're going to go ahead and get rid of this. And put ourselves here we go, and we have mating. Now that we have mating, we're going to go ahead, bring our UI back up. We'll do a time warp for a second to stop the rotation, and unfortunately we're going to have to waste this fuel and go ahead and decouple that stage. And we'll activate this engine here and start some time warp. Once we get into orbit of the moon, we will adjust our orbit a little bit. As you see, we've gotten rid of our S4B stage. It's moving away from us, as is Kerbal. Wow, and look at that sunrise. Coming in, and the only mod we're really using here is Kerbal Alarm Clock, which will hypothetically automatically stop our time warp at 15 minutes away from arriving at the moon. There we go. See, it's come up. And when you're doing a single mission, this is still big because it prevents you from warping past your intended destination. However, if you are actually trying to manage a large space program, it is essential, because Kerbal Alarm Clock will allow you to manage multiple missions at once, and it will tell you every time a spacecraft is changing its sphere of influence, or that you've set up a maneuver node, and it will save your maneuver nodes. It is really very, very, very convenient. Here we are. We're just going to lower our periapsis quite a bit. Bring it down maybe to about 50. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and add a maneuver node at periaps to circularize our orbit. 52 by 20. Wow. .44 by 52. That's good enough for me. So what we're going to go ahead and do, we have 1 hour until the maneuver node, so we're just going to get ourselves pointed towards it. It's going to be a 42-second burn. So there's Kerbal, there's the moon. We're going to go ahead and warp until we get to our maneuver node. Look at that, the moon's getting closer. This pass they did relatively recently on the moon with these procedurally generated craters. It looks fantastic. It really does. It's gorgeous. And I mean, they've done so well on pretty much everything in this game. Really, they did a beautiful job, the devs. And I cannot wait until the next update when we are going to have asteroids and larger parts. Instead of me having to slam together all of these tanks and mainsails in order to make a Saturn V, hopefully we'll have big enough tanks for me to do it from single diameter tanks. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and burn. Follow our maneuver node. There we go. We have captured into orbit. That is why that view has changed. We're actually quite a bit early on this node, but we're still looking good here on the map. And 3, 2, 1, engines cut off. We'll delete the node and see what we got. Apoapsis 62, periapsis 48. We'll get a little closer to the periaps and burn some more retrograde just to lower the apo a little bit. There we go. That's really pretty circular. 49 by 48. I can live with that any day. So now we're just going to warp through basically a complete orbit. And then we're going to detach the lander. Land him on the moon. Bring him back into orbit. After, of course, planting a flag to commemorate this. And dock, rendezvous and dock. And fly back to Kerbin. So let's go ahead and undock these two spacecraft. Using the RCS, we'll just back this guy away. And then we're going to switch to the lander. The lander, of course, needs to burn retrograde. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and set up a maneuver node. I want to try to come down in this crater over here. So I'm setting ourselves past it because we're going to fire our engines, of course, again after this while we're slowing down to actually land. Oh, of course, I need to activate the engine first. So we'll do that and fire up our engines here, and boom. And now it will all be from here. We'll go ahead and lower the landing gear because, you know, it's better to go ahead and get that taken care of, and I like to roll the spacecraft this way. That's not necessary, I just like to do that. So here we go, altitude dropping, we'll keep warping. Wow, we're coming further past this crater than I intended, so let's go ahead and kill some more velocity here. We're going to get down to about maybe 300 meters a second. There we go, so now we'll be coming down at the edge of the crater and do a little more warping. Get down, we'll do another change in velocity here, course correction so to speak. It's not really a course correction, but we want to keep ourselves maybe around 200 meters a second here on the descent so that we can effectively slow ourselves when we get closer to the ground. And I am trying here now just to kill mostly our horizontal velocity without killing too much of the vertical because we want to keep going down. but we want to be going as much straight down as possible so we don't skip or fall over when we hit the lunar surface. And I'm going to go ahead also and activate our lights, which will help us to get an idea of when we get close to the surface. And from the cockpit, we can see we are now passing 1,000 meters. And we can see the shadow, so we need to watch our velocity. We go, we're getting down, getting down. Let's kill some more, and you can see the lights now on the surface too, which is good. So just killing, it's all about killing the velocity, but not too much. We don't want to go back up. And a nice, easy landing. And we'll extend our ladders. And we'll take out Edrin. Why? Because Edrin sounds like Aldrin, who was, of course, the second man to land on the moon. Edwin Aldrin, who is commonly referred to as Buzz. And here we are, we have arrived at the moon in our Apollo style mission. So now we will plant the flag. One small step for a Kerbal. And we will enjoy that. Let's see what the flag looks like in the sun. Look at that. KSP, Kerbal Space Program. The greatest game ever created. Just get a little bit closer to this ladder here. And we'll get back in our spacecraft. We're not really going to spend much time on the moon because this was really just for the purpose of doing an Apollo style mission, which we have already achieved. We'll go ahead and turn the lights off. First thing we're going to need to do, let's go ahead, set our target. What we're going to want to do is wait until he does basically another full orbit. We're going to want him to be just a little bit behind us. Delete on close. I don't know what's changing SOIs here, but we want him to be a little bit behind us because we're going to try to catch up to him as we launch to orbit. That looks like a good location. And 3, 2, 1, and we are taking off from the lunar surface. Go ahead and start turning over. When you take off from a body without atmosphere, you can basically turn over immediately. Your gravity turn, as long as you're not going to hit any mountains by doing so. Of course, in this case, that was too much because we need to set up our rendezvous to be in a good position with our command module. And ideally, we'd like to get a relatively close rendezvous as soon as possible. So here we go. Unfortunately, we have an inclination issue here, so we're going to go ahead and solve that as much as possible. And now, when we go and get into orbit, we'll try to set it up so that we get a close encounter. That will allow us to relatively easily dock. And here we go, 1.1 kilometers. I can work with that. So now we'll just go ahead. We have 7 minutes until I burn. We're just going to go ahead and find the blue marker here and time warp until that burn. And there we go. There's our burn, and 1. Now we're going to go ahead and get rid of the node to fine-tune our approach. .9. I am very happy with that. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and warp ourselves around until we get to this close approach over here. We're going to kill our relative velocity one to the other and even try to get closer. And once we get really close, we will switch to the other spacecraft to do the actual docking, because this guy does not have RCS. And then it's a simple matter of just flying back to Kerbal, which should be easily enough. So we'll go ahead and put that at like 16 meters a second, heading straight towards him. And once we get even closer, we will kill that velocity. .7 meters a second relative. Just kill the rest of it. 0.1, I'm okay with that. We'll go ahead and switch now to the Cattern 5. And there we go, we see the lander, which we'll go ahead and set as our target. And we're just going to use at this point RCS to move ourselves in. We're obviously heading above it. We want to be moving below it because, as we see, the docking port is facing that way. So let's just move on in. As we're getting very close, as we can all see. And once we do, we will just bring ourselves in for a nice dock. Set the docking port as our target. And just go ahead and line up our indicators. At this point, it's just a matter of letting the spacecraft move right into each other and have a nice docking sequence. We'll do a quick time warp here, but not too much. And turn off our SAS so that they will agree to mate. And look at that, Kerbal in the background. They're thinking about docking. They're trying to dock. So let's turn the SAS back on. and turn it back off, and let's see what happens. There we go, and now we have our docking. Great. So all we have to do at this point is take our Kerbals who are in the lander and move them over to our command pod. At this point it's more or less smooth sailing. And one more. And there we go. Everyone is now in the command pod. We'll go ahead and undock. Use the RCS to back away. And we will plot our Kerbal return course, which will be about from here. And we're just going to go ahead and get ourselves on a re-entry trajectory. 48 is too high. 16, I'm down with that, 16. So we're just going to go ahead and point ourselves towards the blue dot like usual. We have 37 minutes, and from which we might as well watch here while we time warp. Just leaving the lunar lander here in orbit and sending ourselves home. And we'll go ahead and now fire our engines. We don't have to be that exact here. And let's see, what does our trajectory look like? Look at that. We have a 32 kilometer periapse. 21, that sounds good. So let's go ahead and just warp until we get out of range of the moon. Goodbye, moon. We will see you next time. It was a good mission. And as everyone can see, we have really had on every single stage of this mission an excess of fuel. I was just trying to make everything as close as possible to the real Apollo missions and not really paying attention to fuel efficiency in any way. So here we go. Where's Kerbal? So sun. Well, Kerbal should be more or less the same direction as the sun. Here it is. We don't want to, at this point we might as well, there we go. We'll turn off the SAS. Turn ourselves facing retrograde. And we're going to go ahead and drop this stage. And at this point, we're going to have some serious re-entry heat before coming in for our parachute-assisted landing, which should happen on this pass with the 21,000 periapse. We'll do a little warp until we start burning. Look at that burn! You know, we're going almost 3 kilometers a second, which is about 50% more than you would be on just an orbital return. So we should get some serious heat. and you should hear it as well. It's really heating up. At the moment, the current stock game, it's only a visual effect. There is no danger from this heat. However, there is a mod that will allow that called Deadly Re-Entry. I do not play with that mod usually, and I'm not using it right now. This was entirely stock with the exception of Alarm Clock, which is really just a useful plugin but adds no parts, nor does it change the game in any way, shape, or form. Once we get through this heat and drop our velocity enough, we're going to go ahead and deploy our parachutes and hopefully come in for a nice, safe ocean landing. Of course, on a real re-entry, spacecraft have to worry very much about the angle that they re-enter. If they re-enter too steeply, they will pull too many G's and they will heat up too much and burn up, which is not convenient for the astronauts on board. Whereas if they come in too shallow, they can skip off of the atmosphere and fly back into space, which is also really not in the best interest of the astronauts on board. But these effects are not really modeled in this game. The re-entry heat, again, is simply aesthetic. And here we go, deploying the parachutes. And as far as atmospheric skipping, the model of atmosphere in Kerbal Space Program does not really lend itself to that. However, if you use another mod called FAR, Ferrum Aerospace Research, it makes a more realistic aerospace model, aerodynamic model, which does include atmospheric skipping among other things. I do not have that installed currently. So here we go. The parachutes are fully deployed, coming down at 8.1 meters per second, which should be soft enough to put us down nicely here in the ocean. And that is our Apollo Style moon mission in Kerbal Space Program. Thanks for watching. Hope everyone has a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.